Hello and welcome to Security Scan. I am Vishal Dahiya. Today we will discuss terrorism in South Asia, the ideology and finance. Terrorism is a major crisis of our age and is at the forefront of international politics nowadays. South Asia is at the heart of global terrorism. Most of the countries surrounding India are affected by political instability most of the time. But main focus of terrorism has been Pakistan and West Asia, from where majority of people and finance in support of terrorism has been mobilized. South Asia terrorist groups increasingly prefer to work collectively even when there is little ideological convergence among their objectives. In the 2017 index of Basel Anti-Money Laundering Index, which has assessed 146 countries regarding money laundering and terror financing risks, India's immediate neighborhood stands out with particularly high risk scores. While Afghanistan is placed at second position, Nepal is at 14th and Sri Lanka at 25th place. Pakistan too has made it to the top 50 with 46th place on the index. Terrorists have become well versed in the discourses of violence, hatred, extremism, sectarianism and intolerance. Terror tactics require constant study and analysis in order to find measures to eliminate this menace. So, what are the challenges in terms of ideology and financing of terrorism in South Asia, and how can these challenges be overcome and tackled? For a detailed discussion on this, we are joined by a distinguished panel of guests in the studio today. Let me introduce you to them, starting with Saikat Dutta, consulting editor, Scroll.in. We also have with us Arif Mohammad Khan, a former union minister, and we have with us Mr. Vikram Sood, former chief of R&AW, Research and Analysis Wing, the External Intelligence Agency of India. Welcome, all of you. Let me begin with you, Mr. Sood. How difficult the situation is with respect to the ideology aspect as well as finance aspect of terrorism, specifically in South Asia?
Well, let me sort of preface my comments by saying that no terrorism can survive without ideology. That's the start point. But it can only be sustained by money. So the two get interlinked. If you have the money, you can sustain terrorism. If you don't have the money, terrorism, as we know, as on a larger scale, on the kind of activity that's going on in Kashmir or went on in Punjab, has always had a state backing, has had unlimited resources. They come illegally, they come through hawala channels, they come through counterfeits, they come through donations, charities, remittances. So there's a mixture of what is ostensibly legal money and a mixture of illegal money. And unless you turn off this spigot, you're never ever going to be actually able to begin to control terrorism.
Okay. Let me bring in Mr. Khan here. Mr. Khan, terrorism is said to be not having any intrinsic link with any specific community, any specific religion, any specific caste, race, or even location. So that clearly explains that there are definitely ideologies which fuel this kind of sentiment, which forces people to go ahead and take up arms. And as Mr. Sood was pointing out, finance is definitely an important angle. We'll come back to that. But in terms of ideology, where do you see the entire gamut of terrorism is placed?
Ideology is very important, and I totally agree that without ideology and money, it is very impossible, it is almost impossible for them to survive. But we must not forget that till before the advent of democracy, the world over, the power game was determined by use of force. It was through arms, weapons, violence, blood shedding that people used to form the governments, establish their empires. So the mankind, I would say, is like the struggle between your passions and intelligence. Mankind has been using passions for millions of years, whereas the development or evolution of reason has happened only during last 10,000 years. Similarly here, we have been using violence for very long period of time to form the governments. Whereas this democracy is only few hundred years old. Today in countries where there is no democracy, how the change is effected? Through violence and conspiracy. Because something which is not provided in the constitution, if you get together to execute something, a plan which is not provided in the constitution, that is the change of the political establishment which exists at that particular point of time, how do you do it? Only through violence. So we must also not, this very tendency where I wish to impose, everybody has a view. The civilized method is that you go to the people, you mobilize public opinion, you win them to your side, and then through a democratic process, you can implement the agenda which you have in your mind. But then we see everywhere, in fact even in democracies, where some people they resort to violence to impose their views on others, and so, this is what terrorism is.
Okay, let me bring in Saikat here. Saikat, as Mr. Khan is pointing out, the way of violent protest or the way of violence being used is something which is not new. It has been there intrinsic to our civilization for centuries now, but it's a modern world now. It's a different world. Democracy might be just a few hundred years old or just a few decades old in some places, but then still we are developing. It's a modern world. Is it because some communities believe that their freedom of expression is being trampled upon, or their freedom of expressing themselves in some other way is being trampled upon?
So it's as my previous co-panelists have pointed out, it's a very complex issue. So let me just try and break it down into a few simpler things. So more than ideology, I think ideology becomes a tool in my opinion, but more than ideology, it is basically, it's more about politics and the political struggle for power, where certain kinds of people, because of various factors, would try and use ideology or ideological means to radicalize certain groups of people, which then becomes terrorism. So for example, if you were to look at what happened, how the ISIS was born, it basically split out of what used to be known as the Al-Qaeda of the Arab Peninsula, AQAP. And the person who really formed the ISIS in those days, before it formally became ISIS, started espousing a violent ideology which was far more violent than what even the Al-Qaeda. And in fact, that led to a massive fight between the two organizations.
And an eventual split.
And then they started overtaking the Al-Qaeda to a large extent and occupying territory. So basically the old classical issues which Mr. Khan has just pointed out, that it's also a grab for political power. That political power is then used, there are various means through wars, etc. So ideology becomes a powerful means to grab political power. And while democracy is not very old, but if you look at some of the areas from where terrorism has erupted, whether in the Middle East or South Asia, the democracy is not there at all. For example, if you were to look at some of the Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia does not have democracy, UAE does not have democracy, Syria has no democracy. And your opening remarks, you said that South Asia is a hub. I would say that actually it's not South Asia, but Pakistan, which is the hub. And Pakistan has not been a democracy for decades.
Okay. Is it, Mr. Sood, is it because of the democracy, or is it because of the lack of democracy? Because some in the West Asian countries, as pointed out by him, do not have democracy. Some countries which are known to be largest financiers or supporters of terror elements do not have democracy.
Terrorism generally arises, as Saikat mentioned, in places where you don't have normal avenues of expression. So you resort to underground methods. You resort to madrasas, maybe you resort to churches, or wherever you go underground. That gives birth to terrorism eventually. What has happened is that this kind of terrorism got an official sanction, if I may call it that, in the Afghan war of the 80s, where the Americans actually espoused the cause of jihad for their own Cold War interests and left the region after they had accomplished their task. So they left the jihadis behind but went off themselves. And we are now reaping that.
Okay. That's just one part of it, Mr. Sood. But if I come back to the points which were made by Mr. Khan in his initial remarks, and you've been at the helm of affairs of India's external intelligence agency, in terms of ideology, how difficult it is for the security agencies and for the state, whichever state it may be, and for the government per se, to go ahead and crack that ideology, because the ideology always seems to remain intact. Terrorist die, new come up, but the ideology seems to have always remained intact in the long run.
Ideology cannot be broken by the intelligence agencies. It is a societal function. So it is the society which has to wean those ideologues away from their ideology. The intelligence, the armed forces can only take you up to a point, i.e. curb.
Can do the firefighting at the initial stage.
Do the firefighting, do the investigation, or collect the intelligence, and then it's left to the governments of the day, the societies of the day, to break the ideology.
Okay, so the onus falls back on the government. Mr. Khan, you've been part of the government also. You've been a former union minister.
I said society, actually.
Yeah, society per se, government also, because it's at the end of the day, the state is the government. In a democracy, it has to be decisions.
Leadership has to be provided.
It has to be decided by the government. So when the onus falls of on the government, do you believe, not only in the Indian context, but as Mr. Saikat was also pointing out, our immediate neighbor Pakistan, which is known to of terror activities, has successive governments or successive leadership failed to take on that particular honors, take on that challenge and perform to that particular level wherein ideologies could be broken or those hiccups which are there could be overcome?
I totally agree with Mr. Sood that ideology can be fought only by an ideology, an alternative ideology. You know, I'll give you the recent example. In 1986, Muslim Personal Law Board went to the town saying that this law is immutable. And every provision of it is divine. But last 30 years, the fight, it was conclusively, there was a great change in the mindset of the people. And they started realizing that they themselves are describing this practice as innovation. How innovation can be part of the divine law. Innovation, the very definition, innovation has been added on later on. Similarly, and now the stance has considerably changed. Now I tell you, about 15 years back, Dr. Suhail Abbas, a Pakistani trained, Paris trained, he is a Pakistani, he has been trained in Paris as a professional psychiatrist. During the old Afghan days, when the Mujahideens, the so-called Mujahideen, were crossing the border to fight the Soviet forces. Many people went there, but out of them, 537 individuals who had gone to fight there, they were arrested by Afghan government. And later on, they were handed over by Afghan government to the Pakistani government. And they were lodged. They were lodged in 2 jails. And Suhail Abbas has interviewed each one of them. And his conclusion is startling. The conclusion is that 90% of them were direct product of Deobandi madrasas, and 10% were heavily influenced by them.
Okay.
Now, my question is that don't we know what is being taught there? Have we done anything? Or even, in fact, I'm surprised that people, we are not even aware of this syllabus. This, I'm saying, this syllabus, I have written about it, and this article of mine was, I think it was carried, if I remember correctly, about 7-8 years back. It was carried on the front page. But so far, I have not heard any, I'm not saying action in the sense of that you go against them, but at least try to understand the problem.
To understand the problem,
understand the problem.
Take remedial measures to ensure.
Exactly. Because why I'm saying, because then after reading this book of Suhail Abbas, I got these books from books on jihad, on which are part of their syllabus. I got from Deoband itself, and I can't tell you that not even one line there accords with the verses of the Quran. Quran is absolutely clear. On the other hand, what they are teaching in the name of jihad, in the name of Muslim law, is totally, I mean, it can do nothing but promote terrorism.
Okay, let's have a quick reaction from Saikat on this. Saikat, very significant statement being made by Mr. Khan that it is generally, the homegrown elements which we overlook, or the homegrown factors which we overlook rather, if not elements.
So let me draw, just like the study that Mr. Khan pointed out, there has been another study which was done where almost 2,000 people who joined the ISIS were interviewed by another psychiatrist, an American psychiatrist, and she came up with 4 or 5 key reasons. And what I'm doing is, currently I've also spoken to a lot of people who signed up for the ISIS, but the government of India has decided not to arrest them, but however they are under watch, and I have interviewed many of them. What comes out is some common factors are, one of course is that there is a feeling of alienation, which could be because of a number of factors, or a denial of justice. Now the availability of a group which can then suddenly tell you, saying that once you become a member, we will be able to address some of your issues, etc. That connect becomes very important in the growth of terrorism. What happens is there is at some level a failure of the state, because the state is not able to understand what that individual is feeling and therefore address those concerns of that person.
Okay.
And so because of this vacuum, religion suddenly is misused and ideology becomes an issue which is exploited by people with vested interest
in the name of religion.
In the name of religion, and they're radicalized. And I've gone through almost 107 interrogation reports of those who were arrested and not arrested, and in each one of those cases the same thing is coming out constantly, that there is a vacuum which is exploited and these people then get radicalized.
Okay, that is the ideological part. We are left with a little time, so let's go back to what Mr. Sood pointed out in his initial marks. Coming back to you again, Mr. Sood, in terms of finances, you're pretty right in terms of ideology. It is not up to the intelligence agencies to go ahead and crack the ideology. You can bring that fight to a particular level. But in terms of finances, repeatedly we've seen that, a check on financing the terror activities is something which has not happened to that particular level, so that the terror activities can be brought under control.
It is one of the most difficult tasks to crack the financial connections, because money is fungible. You don't know where it is, how much it is there. I mean, things like demonetization even might have helped, in the sense that if there is black money, if there is counterfeit money, that much has been gone. But it will come back. So it's not a final solution. You have to therefore watch all your remittances. You have to go into a cashless system. As a security person, I would be much happier if there is a cashless, all transactions are traceable.
That's what exactly the government of the day is doing.
I think that would be the step towards ruling this out, because in today's world, the criminal terrorist nexus, the GDP of this is about $1.5 trillion. It was in 10 years ago, would have gone up now. That is the GDP of Great Britain. That's the kind of money that's floating around in all sorts of activities. You cannot control this without international cooperation. International cooperation is not always available because your terrorist is not my terrorist.
How do you look at this this Basel index, which I spoke about in the opening remarks, and that places almost all India's neighbors in the top list? Afghanistan is at number 2, Pakistan is at 46, Sri Lanka and Nepal are also in the first 25. So is that has that always been the cause of concern, even when you were at the helm of affairs?
It has always been. The Pakistan and Afghanistan have always been a cause of concern.
How about Nepal and Sri Lanka and others?
First of all, Pakistan. Nepal, because the easy transactions that took place, they didn't mean to do harm.
Porous border and
it was a boarding place. It was a place of exchange. But Sri Lanka, because since the LTTE days has become another hub, and Afghanistan had very little law and order left after the jihad, so it was lawlessness leads to all these things. So if you cannot stop hawala, if you cannot stop counterfeit, if you cannot stop black market money, you're not going to win.
Okay, Saikat, do you agree with Mr. Sood in 2 terms that the answer to blocking or rather killing the financial resources of the terror outfits is to go cashless? One, have more interaction or cooperation with the other countries and other international bodies, and 3, the most important part, that our neighborhood, as the index is also pointing out, and Mr. Sood is saying during his time as well, this was a major cause of concern which still remains.
Let's start with the cashless thing. I don't think cashless will really make a difference, because just as we started moving into the digital payments segment, we also are now looking at blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies. So now with cryptocurrencies and blockchain, we have now come to a stage where they are also digital payments. But
so you're saying that let's not forget that even terror organizations are as modern as our agencies are?
No, it's not a question of whether they're as modern as our agencies are. That's not the point. The point is that while the agencies are quite modern, the point is technology has overtaken the means of finance, and now we have gone into blockchain technology, or we have gone into what is called cryptocurrencies, which are very, very difficult to track. And there is no international agreement right now at a multilateral level where who will decide what. But these have a huge bearing. For example, bitcoins were at one point trading at almost $5,000. So that's the kind of money that we are looking at. So technology, so the answer is not going cashless or going digital. The answer is that how can we ensure that there is some commonality. For example, India for a long time has been asking for a United Nations Convention on Terrorism, because once we do that, we will be able to put pressure on certain nation states which have been financing terror, and that's the only way I think feasible that you can push this.
So, concluding remarks from you, Mr. Khan, on the financial part of it.
You know, my question basically is that those who provide the financial support, are they motivated by any ideology? They are motivated by their own political interests.
Okay. So basically, we're coming back to where we started.
Afghanistan. Does America believe in the jihadi ideology when they were supporting them? When Israel was providing weapons to them, does Israel support jihadi ideology?
I think certainly not.
It is basically, you know, we must understand. We have a beautiful 2 lines in Mahabharata, which says, "Na kaschit kasse chit chin mitram, na kaschit kasse chit ripu." Artha tastu nibaddhyante mitrani rip vastatha. It is your self-interest which drives you, which determines your friendship and your enmity. There is nothing like permanent friendship. There is nothing like. The question is that these people who are providing support, if they are not ideologically in agreement with these elements, then why they are supporting it? They are supporting because it serves their own political. Yesterday the actor was A. Today the actor is B. Tomorrow the actor may be C.
Maybe C. So
we have to safeguard our own interests. We can't depend on others.
Okay, so it serves the purpose of those who are financing these terror activities, as our panelists are pointing out. And one important common point which all of them have made is that it is for the government of the day, for the society at large to go ahead and take those preventive measures as well as take those measures to eliminate terror, to eliminate the ideology of terror, and most importantly, the finance and the support it gets from various places and sources. We'll come back again with a different topic and a different set of guests. Till then, keep watching Rajya Sabha Television.